Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to joint event of Prague Center for Middle East Relations and Prague Center for Transatlantic Relations of Severo Institute. The event itself is part of Forum 2000's Festival of Democracy. Today's topic is going to be Taliban's victory in Afghanistan, impacts of US withdrawal on European and global security. My name is Tomáš Kamálek. I am the director of Prague Center for Middle East Relations, and I will be one of your moderators today. First thing first, we have to abide by the contemporary epidemiological measures. So you have to either have PCR test not older than 7 days, negative antigen test, not older than 72 hours, make a self-test before you came here, or have a proof that you had COVID within 180 days, or of course, have a finalized vaccination at least 14 days long. Also, I would like to ask you, please wear your face masks for the whole duration of the event. The last thing we would want to have COVID outbreak at one of our debates. Thank you very much. Today we have a distinguished guest with us, Professor Gilles Kepel. He's a French political scientist and Arabist who specializes in contemporary Middle East and Muslims in the West. Mr. Kepel is a professor at Paris Sciences et Lettres, as well as chair of the Middle East and Mediterranean program at École Normale Supérieure. He's also a director of the Middle Eastern Mediterranean Free-Thinking Platform at Università della Svizzera Italiana in Lugano. He's the author of numerous widely acclaimed books, including, and most recently translated into English, Terror in France, The Rise of Jihad in the West, and the latest one, Away from Chaos, the Middle East and the Challenge to the West. We are also going to have that one translated to English. Professor Kepel said, hopefully, inshallah, by the end of this year. In Czech language, so you can buy it as a suitable Christmas gift to your loved ones. This book was reviewed by the New York Times as an excellent primer for anyone wanting to get up to speed on the region. So today's topic, we came up with it amid chaotic withdrawal of coalition forces from Afghanistan. Taliban again decisively took control of the country. Consequently, we are having a number of pressing questions, such as what does this mean for Islamist movements across the globe, both in Islamic world and in the West? What does US disengagement, not only from Afghanistan, but arguably also from the Middle East, and we may even say in Europe, imply amid Washington's continuous refocus on the South Pacific? And what implications, of course, this can have for European security in particular? These are pressing questions not only for us sitting here in Central Europe and in Europe in general. This is also a pressing question for other US allies across the globe and in the Middle East. I have just recently returned from Iraqi Kurdistan, where one of the main topics across academics, across leadership, across intellectuals, across journalists and common people was, if we saw what happened in Afghanistan with the US disengagement, this may also happen to us, and we will be left without one of the main guarantors of existence of Iraqi Kurdistan. So it's a topic that's widely discussed and followed, and the US disengagement was followed with huge anxiety on the side of Kurdish people. At the same time, discussions are whether European countries can assume or continue to have a role in Iraqi Kurdistan in particular, while most people's opinion is, well, Europe is not capable or prepared to do so, or at least they did not show that intent. Without the US, they fear there will be no significant European or Western presence in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in general. That being said, I would also like to introduce my co-moderator, Tomáš Pojar. He's member of Prague Center for Transatlantic Relations Board, and he's also vice president of Severo Institute. He's well vested in Middle Eastern topic and in transatlantic relations. He also served as ambassador, Czech ambassador to Israel in 2010 and 14. As I said, he has immense experience with the Middle East and is a keen observer of also American foreign policies. So perhaps, Tomáš, you should also give us a short opening statement before we give floor to Professor Keppel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. My opening statement is that I just returned from United States of America, and part of the discussions were about Afghanistan and the US decision making and what to expect, so I can follow up afterwards. I want to welcome here Ambassador of Afghanistan to the Czech Republic and former American Ambassador to Pakistan, Cameron Munter, who is here with our Transatlantic Center. So I encourage you to take part in the discussion afterwards, but it's always a pleasure to listen to read books of Gilles Keppel and to listen to Gilles Keppel because of his enormous knowledge and also because of his attachment to Czech Republic and his Czech roots. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and so dobre večer. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here, and COVID-19 not only precipitated a number of unwanted events in the Middle East, but it also did not allow me to come to Nadějkov, where I am from, so it was even maybe more terrible for me. So thanks for having me and for bringing together this, what you have nicely encapsulated into your introduction, which is so complicated. And definitely after I was going to say the Soviet pullout from Kabul, so this is what came to my mouth, you know. After the US pullout, so I should slash the US pullout from Kabul this summer in mid-August, this midsummer night dream or nightmare. We received a sort of it's not an advance warning, it's a final warning, because this had been in the books for a long time, because as they say, Obama thought about it, then Trump said it, and Biden did it. As they, I think, say in the Czech Republic, Masaryk thought about it, Stefanik said it, and Beneš did it. So, you know, this was not something that was unexpected. What was unexpected was that it went so bad, and that it took place in a panic. There were terrorist attacks, and also that no allies who had contributed blood and money to US policy in Afghanistan were really warned not to mention and consulted in advance. And this definitely left a rather terrible impression, not only, as you rightly said, Tomáš, on allies in the region, and definitely people in northeastern Syria fighting jihadists and being camp wardens to former ISIS terrorists may wonder what their fate will be between the Turkish hammer and the Iranian anvil. But this is also an issue for us as Europeans. Being French, then I have to quote what my president said in English to The Economist, i.e. NATO is brain dead. It's not that it's really brain dead, but there are legitimate questions as to whether the eastern part of the United States, the look east of the United States, is still a priority, but you'll tell us as you just came back, and depending who you talk to, I imagine, in the US now. As you know, NATO was so crucial because the North Atlantic was the seas, the high seas, the ocean that separated the US from the former Soviet Empire. Now there is no Soviet Empire anymore. There is a state which can be qualified by various names, which is Russia, which is not necessarily a friend for everybody, to use a euphemism. But it's not, the threat is not of the same magnitude as it was in the old days of the USSR. And so it may be understandable that now the US wants to concentrate on its confrontation, quote unquote, with China, whereas I don't believe that the Bank of the USSR ever owned treasure bonds from the US and manufactured toilet paper and whatever, and suitcases for American supermarkets, and to what extent corporate America is gonna get on board on that warship or those submarines against China is another question. But as far as we're concerned, definitely there is a loss of interest, of American interest in what is east of the US. What is east of the US reaches out to, let's say, India or something like that, because then from India it comes west of the US, because as you know, as my quasi-homonym or paronym Kepler said in this very city some time back, there are some things which go around, so what does that make for us? I mean, are we comprised as European in this sort of global neglect of the eastern side of the U.S. and how should we manage and how did it happen? So let me start with in the limited amount of time that I have to make bring together some hypotheses on how did that happen. And then part two will be what can we make of it. The Soviet pullout, once again, you know, really, the U.S. pullout is something that, as I mentioned, had already been announced way back. And the fact that the US did not do it earlier actually probably was part and parcel of what allowed Trump to win the elections, because as you know, in the so-called swing states or former blue-collar states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and others, people who did not have unionized jobs anymore because the factories had been delocated to China, then went into security groups, Blackwater and what have you, went into Iraq, or as they say in America, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, the stands, and many of them came back dead or crippled. And this gave way to a big anti-war voting bank, anti-endless wars voting bank, as Mrs. Clinton was more of a warmonger than Donald Trump. So he he got the votes, and as we know, one of the reasons why Biden was chosen was that he was the one who could get those votes back to the Democrats. Hence, he felt a real political obligation to deliver ahead of the midterms. And this is, to a large extent, understandable from an American point of view. And such a question is also going to be posed for the French and to some extent the Czechs, because you are in Mali with us. And the situation in Mali is not totally unlike what happens in Afghanistan. I mean, a military Western intervention to stop, well, the circumstances are not exactly the same, but to stop a jihadi attack, and then a government which is not really up to par, where people are interested more into making money for themselves and their families than developing the country. And in Mali, we've now have a series of coups, and the new junta says that they think that the Wagner group of Russian mercenaries looks okay. So do we still want to be on board with them is definitely at issue. So, you know, it's not, American behavior as a behavior is not totally irrational. And you cannot also say that you're against US imperialism and condemn the fact that they pulled out from Afghanistan. But the consequences in terms of realpolitik and the, you know, are in a way stem from what took place and were precipitated, I would say, by what took place earlier on, in particular during COVID days in year 2020. Because, as you may know, 2020 preceded 2021. I think that a sea change happened in the Middle East in this year, which also had to do with the feeling that America was not that present and consistent. That is the consequence of COVID-19 on the energy market. For the first time in history, the oil barrel went to minus $37. It has now rebounded, as you know, but nevertheless, it sent shivers down the spine of the petrol monarchies. And as I know, there are a number of Arabists in this room, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, of the Emirates, of Kuwait and Qatar would also always tell you, okay, we know, we are aware of global warming, we're aware of renewables, bukra, inshallah, which is tomorrow, inshallah, we'll deal with that. Now they got aware that whatever the rebounds in the prices may be this fall with renewed activity, post-COVID activity, nevertheless, they should be more proactive in terms of building the future, that is, being producers of renewables. And that led, in my sense, to the acceleration of the so-called peace process, or was it about peace? I'm not sure. The business partnership, rather, that is known as the Abraham Agreement. You know that Donald Trump thought that the Donald Agreement would be a better name, but so such was it. And which is, in a way, an opportunity for the petro monarchs who, you know, have sovereign funds which are really huge, thousands of millions of dollars under gestion, and to invest in the technology which is needed to build the energy transition in the Middle East, i.e. to use sun and wind more and more, and or atomic energy and nuclear energy, and fossil fuels and gas less and less. So in order to do so, you have to invest in those new technologies. Those technologies are available in a number of countries, high-tech countries, but there is one high-tech country, the startup nation of all startup nations is in Israel. So why not join forces? And this is, of course, beneficial to the Israelis as well. And this, I believe, is changing the name of the game in the Middle East. Because, in a way, it makes the Middle East, should we say, less special, because it will be an important source of renewables, renewable energy. You know, there is this, in Saudi Arabia, there's this sort of NEOM part of the kingdom, which is in the northwest by the Red Sea, and as they say in Saudi Arabia, it's close to Jordan and close to Egypt. Well, it's actually very close to Israel. Eilat is 45 kilometers from NEOM. It's, to a large extent, the center of the peninsula is shifting, at least for the Saudis, from step by step, but it's shifting from an exclusive interest on the Gulf, whether you call it Arabian or Persian, and this may be the problem, actually for them, to the Red Sea. To the Red Sea, which is now a major driveway for the Chinese on the One Belt, One Road web, the spider web that they have on the planet. They also invest tremendously in Egypt, where I don't know how many thousands babies were born since we started this lecture, with more than 100 million inhabitants, and they look at it as a sort of manufacturing country, a sort of little China of sorts, though I have my doubts whether the Egyptian worker will be as efficient as the Chinese worker, but maybe it's because they don't have communism, or didn't have communism. And so anyway, this is a big change which is happening. And this is going to bring a new dimension to the Middle East insertion into the global system. It's going to be less special. It's not going to be the Middle East of the Valentine's Day 1945 agreement between Ibn Saud and Roosevelt when he came out of Yalta, and they signed this major deal, you know, on USS Quincy, moored in the bitter lakes of the Suez Canal, and as it was Valentine's Day, they exchanged eternal words. In French is better because it rhymes, amour toujours, so they had to say it in English or in Arabic where it doesn't rhyme. So my oil against your protection against my oil, which was to a large extent the fate of the Middle East, with the Israeli, of course, issue interfering in the middle. Now, you know, it's not as exclusive. I mean, there is no FDR in the White House meeting a Saudi king on a boat to sort of prepare for the world of tomorrow. And so the Middle Eastern power cum money, i.e. the Peninsula Arabs, were looking for a different way to be inserted into the global system, which will be less peculiar, but may be more forward-looking. This means that American protection is not of the same kind as it was yesterday. They need protection. They still can't do on their own, but it is taking a different dimension, and also because the Abraham Agreement means that Israel is going to protect its allies. Israel is the most potent army in the region. It has acquired the steel bombers, the US steel bombers F-35. Turkey has been deprived of them because they were trusted unreliable or unworthy after they had bought Russian-made ground air missile S-400s, and the Emirates are going to get the F-35s, the United Arab Emirates, in compensation, which are allied now with the Israelis and which are the sort of more pushy element in the alliance, relating also to their immense wealth. So this has introduced a number of changes. Also, the U.S. capacity to rein in its allies in the region was tested in 2020 and had already been started to be tested before, but was tested to a sort of a point of irritants, if I may say so, in July 2020, when, on the one hand, because of the pandemic, the Saudi Crown Prince, who maybe had some things to be forgiven for, decided that there will be no pilgrimage, no Hajj in Mecca and Medina at the pilgrimage season. In the end, it was the end of July last year, and that is to say that, you know, the images of, or for the photo ops for the strength of Islam, 2.5, 3 million people chanting Allahu Akbar under the aegis of the Saudi kingdom, something that sort of displayed the soft power, not so soft, but of the religious and political power of Saudi Arabia, did not happen. What happened in those same days? Erdogan decided to re-Islamize Hagia Sophia, and you know, he did this on the 24th of July because it was during the pilgrimage, and also so he could pull the carpet under the feet of the Saudis and display the strength of Islam in Istanbul, not in Mecca. And also he chose that date for internal domestic reasons because this was the anniversary of the Lausanne Treaty that came after World War I, and which was a consequence of Atatürk's military campaigns that sort of rebuilt for Turkey, or carved for Turkey, much of the territory of what is now the Turkish Republic, whereas the victorious countries of World War I wanted to deal with the Ottoman Empire like they dealt with the Kakania, the Habsburg monarchy, i.e. cut it in pieces. And so Erdogan, in a way, put on the one hand his feet on the boots of Atatürk, saying, hey, I'm doing that because this is national sovereignty, like Atatürk did, that ended in the Lausanne Treaty. But in doing so, he could twist the arm of the secular Atatürk, who had turned Hagia Sophia into a museum as a gift to humanity. And he also put his feet in the slippers of Sultan Mehmet II, the Conqueror, Sultan Mehmet Fatih, who conquered Constantinople in 1453, making of Hagia Sophia, which was a Byzantine basilica at the time, a mosque. So all this, you know, was something that in a way became complicated to deal with for America, because the behavior of a power, a local power like Turkey, did not abide by NATO rules. I mean, he got closer to Putin, but Putin is not Stalin anymore, even though he's a descendant, but it's not the USSR. But nevertheless, it's considered a country hostile to the US and to the West to many extents, to some extent. And so all this created a much more complex situation for the US. So with new alliances locally, with the Emirates, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Israelis banded together, after all, the threat didn't have that magnitude for the US anymore. ISIS had been destroyed. There was no organized jihadi terrorism in sight. So, after all, why not pull out? From a US point of view, you know, due to the fact that they still have their huge air base in Al-Udeid in Qatar, and that they also can send troops rapidly if necessary. So this looked like, you know, we are going to relocate. Not only we're going to look west, i.e. to the South Pacific, so maybe replace the NATO by what the SPITO, or South Pacific Treaty Organization. But it's not that urgent for us. And of course, the issue is different for the Europeans, because we are neighbors to the Middle East. We're physical neighbors. We all live around the Mediterranean. And as you know, migration, illegal migration or non-illegal migration, but let's say at least illegal migration from the region to Europe has led to an enormous tension both on the European political systems, like when I came to Prague a couple of days before the election, the first poster I saw on the road from the airport was by someone from mixed Czech-Japanese descent, a poster that said, Ne Muslim Migrantu. So even though my Czech is limited to brambora, vino, and kanec, which is none of those things, I could understand those three words quite easily, because I'm an Arabist, probably. And so the same is true in France. We also have an election. You had yours. Congratulations. We're having an election in the middle of the French presidency, which is going to, as you know, to predate the Czech presidency of the EU next year. We have a guy in the extreme right called Éric Zemmour, who's more or less like your half from Japanese descent. He's actually a Berber from North Africa originally, who's making this huge campaign against migration, against Islam and the like, and he has dwarfed the traditional extreme right in France, if I may say so. Mrs. Le Pen is now lagging behind. I don't believe that he's going to be able to put much pressure on Macron as a probable candidate, but nevertheless it shows that those themes at least feed the fears, real or imaginary, as you like, of the electorate. I mean, it has to be taken seriously from a political point of view. The same is true, of course, for AfD and for Lega in Italy, even though they did not fare very well in the last elections, as you saw. So anyway, this is a big issue. This is not only electorally, because it threatens our own democratic system and sort of and values, which is so dear to Forum 2000, in boosting indirectly the extreme right and illiberal groups like the Visegrad Pact is a sort of consequence of that. But this is also an issue in terms of how we envisage the future of Europe and our relations with those countries in an old continent, which is getting now a very old continent, a room like this, which is not peopled mainly by people over 70, has now become something, an achievement, so congratulations, in Europe. And so all this is part and parcel of this big issue with the Kabul pullout. Now, what are the consequences? One of them is the big issue, and I'm glad that the representative of Afghanistan is here, the Minister for Afghanistan, because he will hear from what he thinks about that, because there are conflicting views on the future. One considers that who cares? This is something which you probably heard a little in the States. After all, the Taliban are nationalists. Well, they're Islamists, of course, they are jihadists, what have you, but they are not interested in exporting terrorism. Let them do what they want in their own country, in the stands. We don't want to hear anything about that, who cares? But they are not going to be like Al-Qaeda or like ISIS. They are not going to export terrorism for the West. So far, so good. And also, you know, China made a deal with them, and so they're interested in business. They're not going to be a rogue emirate or of sorts, and they're not going to give shelter to a new bin Laden, and there is no new bin Laden anyway. So this is one of the views, that is to say, to sort of put down the capacity of the Taliban to capacity of projection of the Taliban's outside. This view is challenged by those who say that, you know, the Taliban of today are not the same as the Taliban of yesterday. It's not only that they are their sons and there's a difference between fathers and sons, not that they actually changed their ideology, but they became the stooges of regional powers. That those Taliban could not have won so easily hadn't it been that both Pakistan and to some extent Iranian forces helped them, trained them to make such a swift military campaign, including the fact that, you know, most of them were cousins of who were the colonels in the army and what have you. I mean, all this that you have read about the country. So, and therefore that, you know, Afghanistan was always called from the West the cemetery of empires. And this goes back to Kipling and, you know, with the so-called Great Game where Russia was pushing south towards the warm seas through Afghanistan, whereas Britain was pushing north in order to contain the Russians, and then the Soviets succeeded the Russians and the Americans, the Brits, and the like. And that, after all, even if you are a nationalist movement, nevertheless, you have to deal with your neighbors and your big neighbors, and you're at the center of great games. And plus, even though fossil energy is waning, nevertheless, in the middle, there was this big Unocal pipeline from Turkmenistan to India that was interested for some, threatening for others. So this is the type of situations that terrorism likes, definitely, and for which jihadism can be used as a tool. So that's question number one. So what to make of the future of Afghanistan is, to me, is really a question mark, as I'm not. I went to Afghanistan under the Taliban, and I was almost killed because they thought I was a Shia at the time. So my driver said, no, he's a French. Oh, it was better to be a French infidel than a Shia heretic. And but I'm not really a specialist of Afghanistan, so I'm glad that we can have some knowledge from the source. So that's one of the big issues. Nevertheless, this is creating definitely a point of uncertainty and fragility in the region, not to mention the fate of the Afghan and the many refugees that have fled the country, who are being received on humanitarian grounds in the West, but among which also a number of other people have taken the opportunity to flee for reasons which are not necessarily political or human rights. And already in the southern part of France, where I have my other roots, on the border with Italy, last month, the highest number of illegal migrants who had tried to get into France were Afghans. So things go very, very fast in terms of going through Turkey, through the Balkan routes and whatever, and this is also an issue for Eastern Europe. Another consequence or another question, and I'll stop there, is what does that mean for us as Europeans? And this may be a question which is even more to the point after the result of the Czech elections, and because this is one of the questions everybody asks himself: what is this new government, whenever it takes shape and whoever leads it, how is he going to deal with the European issue? Is it going to be more pro-European, more integrated into a European idea, or not? And this, I mean, with the permanently destabilized Middle East for the time being, except if we see the fruition of the sort of Abraham Agreement thing, prosperity with Arab Peninsula energy of any kind added to Israeli technology and Egyptian manpower, for instance, which is the sort of magic triangle of the Middle East, but it will maybe take some time to develop, even though there are more slots in the machine this time than there were when Egypt signed peace with Israel, because there was not much complementarity at the time. They just lacked the cash. But it will take time. There are other countries or other groups which are frustrated because they're not part of it, and they would like to put some obstacles on the way and blackmail for that. This is the dustbin which is leaving us. And we as Europeans are concerned in a different way. I mean, this is why this issue of NATO is complicated, because NATO was created to contain and, if necessary, repel the Warsaw Pact. There is no Warsaw Pact anymore. Warsaw is the closest ally of Washington in the EU. And what do you make of Turkey, which is the second army in terms of the number of soldiers in NATO, and which, you know, has not behaved towards Greece and Cyprus, not to mention France, in ways that are considered acceptable by those three other NATO members. So, does Kabul and also the AUKUS agreements between Australia, the US, and the UK, does it become a challenge for Europe, so that we engage into a much more cohesive European security and European defense policy? Not to say that bridges have to be cut with NATO, but by the same token that, to some extent, the US has farmed part of the Middle East security to this Israeli UAE F-35 alliance, if I may say so, within the framework of the Abraham agreements. to what extent do we as Europeans need to have a much more cohesive defense policy, which means, of course, more investments in defense, which means having Germany revise much of its views, something which may also send some shivers on the spines of people who have memory in the region, in our region, or not. So I believe those debates that were rampant or that were latent have now been, to a large extent, reawoken for both the Middle East and North African people and governments, and also for Europeans. And so these were a few bullet points that I wanted to shoot before we start this the debate, and I am looking forward very much to the reactions and the remarks of my colleagues on the panel, and also of all of you, because I think that this is a dimension which has not been really put into that terms or publicized as of now. So maybe it's pipe dreams, or maybe it's a construction which has no validity, and I'm ready to take any kind of discussion and criticism, but I'm glad that you agreed on the terms of this debate. So I would like to say děkuji na most again, and thank you for coming, and also for looking forward very much to our conversation now. Thank you.
Děkuji. Thank you very much for a great contribution. For wrapping up for us the contemporary debate and the very complex geopolitical issues. As a moderator, I will have just one question that will take the debate all the way back to Afghanistan, to Kabul again. Now, my question is whether the Taliban's success did have any impact on, let's say, global Islamist movements in the West or in the region. Did it empower them globally? Is it a success story that somebody tried to replicate? Did it bring any energy into perhaps fatigued after the unsuccessful Daesh period with their so-called caliphate? Thank you.
Well, if you may comment sure, also on the French suburbs, of the Paris suburbs, how much it has been vibrating in the French suburbs, let's say, or in the Paris suburbs, Afghanistan and the victory of Taliban, to be more precise.
Well, I had thought to include that in the question, but it's better when things are said. Thank you. So should I answer those questions first, and then? Okay.
Yes. Then we
well, yeah. Looking at to answer this question, I have to mention something else on which I've worked recently in this latest book, which is what does jihadism look like today? If you allow me for a sort of 5 minutes development, so it will make it clearer, I think. My contention is that, we had three major phases or moments of jihadism in a sort of Hegelian dialectical movement. The first one was from Afghanistan, from the Soviet invasion on Christmas Day 1979, through the Soviet pull-out of Kabul in February 15, 1989, which, as you know, led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And this is not something that people like to hear in this part of the world, because they consider that the Velvet Revolution was something that was purely Czech. But hadn't the Red Army turned like a paper tiger in Kabul a few months before, definitely the Berlin Wall may have fallen after all, but will not have fallen at that time. And then after that, you had the sort of copycat Afghan jihad, which took place with a number of Afghan jihad veterans in Algeria, in Egypt, in Chechnya, and in Bosnia. That failed, ultimately, because they were unable to mobilize the masses to a large extent, you know? So then there was a second phase, which was the international jihad of Al-Qaeda, that considered that in order to mobilize the Muslim masses, you had to wage a psychological war against the West. That, you know, people were afraid to join the so-called Islamist or jihadist vanguard, and that if you showed that the West was fragile, that it was a colossus with feet of clay, then you would mobilize and recruit. And that led to 9/11. Strike the arrogant West and show that it's weak. And so this kind of international terrorism was implemented by a sort of top-down Leninist, if I may say so, organization that trained people to go on planes, went to pilot lessons and whatever. But those people had no grassroots, you know, relations, were not grounded in the West. And then they had all those copycat attacks in London, in Madrid, in Nairobi, where have you. Finally, they had hoped that they would trap the US in Afghanistan. The US did not go to Afghanistan. They used the attack to wage this war on terror that aimed to oust Saddam Hussein and have a friendly pro-American regime in Iraq, which led to the first disastrous war outside the country with many people dead, and they were not security people, they were soldiers. And at the end, the US was trapped in Iraq, not so much by the Sunni insurgency, but also by the Iranians who sent their Pasdaran and, you know, and mobilized the Iraqi Shia militias there. But at the end of the day, Al-Qaeda was unsuccessful. So then you had a third wave or phase of jihadism, which in German terms would be the Aufhebung, or the negation of this dialectics of jihad, which was ISIS or Daesh in Arabic, or which we still also use in French. I.e., it was not a Leninist top-down phenomenon, it was a network-based or reticular system, which linked, you know, say, okay, America is far away, but it's really too far away. It's complicated to go there. There are millions of immigrants from Arab descent in the West. They are not pleased with their fate. They are relegated in the banlieues, in the outskirts of the cities, in the suburbs. So Salafism has already started to gain some ground there. So, and some of the ideologues who actually lived in who lived in the West, who studied in Europe, sort of said that the failure of Al-Qaeda, that it was, you know, it was a top-down phenomenon. Then let's make grassroots terrorism, i.e., attacks in the West by people who live in the West, and make a link with the Arab Springs, because we think of Arab Springs as a sort of reenactment of the velvet revolution, but it was not exactly that. When the states, the authoritarian states crumbled for a while in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, or what have you, they were not replaced by democratic systems, that created a vacuum that the Islamists, the Muslim Brothers, and then the jihadists filled rather quickly. And that was, of course, a blessing for ISIS or Daesh. And so they had this very bloody campaign of terror, which struck my country in particular, which was not the case in the days of Al-Qaeda. And as you know, we are having this huge maxi trial of the 13th of November 2015 attacks, which is now being held in Paris, which will last until June. So, you know, we have a presidential election in April, we have a parliamentary election in June, we have the presidency of the European Union, and in the background we have the maxi, the biggest ever jihadi trial in history, which says a lot about, you know, the relationship between the two. For the time being, it's going well. I mean, it's controlled. It's under control. Last year, when the Charlie Hebdo trial was on way, it went out of control and led to new waves of terrorism. So, this wave of terrorism now that we have after Daesh was defeated, or ISIS was defeated, largely because it was bombed by a coalition of the willing, not only of Westerners and of some Arabs, but also the Iranians and the Russians got in the fray. This was the matter of the JCPOA, the Joint Plan of Action of 2015, which allowed the Russians to bomb the Syrian rebels that had been supported by the West, and so to bring Hafez al-Assad back on stage, with the Iranians also making inroads. So this led to the fact that no such thing as ISIS exists anymore, and that the huge investment in cybersecurity and bombings has destroyed this model of organization. What we have now, and what we experienced particularly in France, but also in Austria and to some extent in Germany last year, but which did not last that much, was what I call jihadism of atmosphere, i.e. you have, on the one hand, entrepreneurs of wrath or entrepreneurs of rage, whatever you want to call it, who target people on the web, say, hey, this guy is an apostate, this guy is an infidel, this guy is a misbeliever, an unbeliever, and he did this and that, and so on and so forth. They don't say kill him, and they act anonymously. They have no organizational or whatever relation with whoever will commit the murder. But then they fill the web, and then you had a guy like Samuel Paty, we're almost close, the anniversary of his decapitation, of his beheading, a teacher in a medium school in France who had shown drawings or cartoons of the Charlie Hebdo to discuss them with his pupils, and who was singled out as an Islamophobe. And then there was this Chechen guy who had no relation whatsoever with the people who posted the messages on the web, who decided that he would behead the teacher. The guy was already brainwashed, but he did not belong to an organization. And there was no link between the physical link between the entrepreneurs of rage on the one hand and the actual killer on the other. So we had that 3 times in a row in France last fall. The same, not this fall, a year ago. The same was true in Austria with some little differences. And so this was very fearful at the time, because, you know, then you cannot find out who does what, because, you know, how can you, and also how can you criminalize someone who looks at something like that on the web? myself and my students spend our time looking at those things. So would we go to jail? And and this was Macron's speech on Islamist separatism, saying that he did not welcome, of course, the building of a separate enclaves ruled by Sharia on French soil, which was not translated into Arabic correctly, which then was understood as wanting a will of the state to make Muslim ghettos and so on and so forth, led to this campaign. But actually, after a while, people were less frightened that it would happen, because, you know, on the one hand, in order to build an efficient terrorism network, you have to be able to be repetitive, to inflict huge damage, so that the masses would mobilize and not fear. It has not happened. I mean, we've had some copycats, but and the monstrosity of the decapitation of a teacher was something that, you know, made people fearful, people who would be sympathizers, you know, fearful of following suit, because they were stricken with horror. And also, most Western states invested tremendously in cyber security. And as this terrorism has to go on the web, and now everything can be cracked or hacked rather easily, you have just to choose whether your data are going to be cracked by Huawei or by the NSA or by Russia Today or what have you. But you know, this is a choice that you have, but you cannot think that your data are totally safe. So for terrorist groups, it's complicated. So this was the small introduction to answer your question. On the web, there was some praise for the Taliban, definitely. Some of our guys who have immigrated to Turkey, which is a country of freedom for Islamists, as opposed to Islamophobic France, as they said, they lauded the Taliban. They said now that there would be roads and hospitals and Sharia and everything would be great. But, you know, after a while, it sort of petered out. I mean, it did not really raise a significant following, also because Afghans are not Arabs, even though there was a legacy of, you know, Jihad mythology against the Soviets and then Mullah Omar and the like. The image is rather blurred, and the burqa culture is not even Salafi culture. So there were a number of approvals, but they did not, from what I could monitor, it did not really lead, as of now, to a major rise in jihadi attacks or movements. So not to say that it will be unconclusive, because if there is a warfare in Afghanistan, there are solidarities, people coming from wherever to Afghanistan, having brigades and whatever. I mean, I don't know, but then we should maybe have listen to what our Afghan friend here has to say about it, because he's more knowledgeable than I am.
All right, let me, before I turn it to the audience, and we have also Michal Černý, who used to be our chargé d'affaires in Tehran, and Matyáš Zrno, who used to be running our provincial reconstruction team in Afghanistan, so we have some people knowledgeable about the region. But let me give you 3 short questions, and we have just 15 minutes, so I ask for short answers if possible.
This is difficult.
That's difficult, yes, so we will try. First, I think you mentioned Abraham Accords, and you mentioned that it's very much linked to the business partnerships and this transition from oil into post-oil economy. I agree to that because this can be the substance of the relations of Israel and the GCC countries or some others, and reasoning for the GCC countries like the Emirates to go for it or Bahrainis. But I do see equally strong bond or pressure, which is under the headline of that the enemies unite, meaning that it was Iran, an Iranian threat, and the Sunni-Shia divide and competition, which then led to the partnership of the Arab states with the Israelis because of that threat perception or ideological threat perception. Would you agree or not, or how much that has played?
Okay.
You know?
That's question one, or
That's question one.
you want three in a row?
No, go
Okay,
ahead,
fine.
because the others are related to France again.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, it's not so much the Sunni Shia. Iran, definitely, but it was more a strange alliance, which I developed this idea in the book at length, which I called a new triple alliance between backing the Muslim Brothers and political Islam: Turkey, Qatar, and Iran. I.e., you know, we were used to think in terms of Sunni-Shia opposition. But the allies of Qatar, when it was under blocus or blockades or by its neighbors from Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Emirates, and Egypt, were Sunni countries. Iran, and one was a Sunni country, Iran, and the other was a Sunni country, Turkey, and a Shia country, Iran. So, you know, when you think of the Muslim Brothers and political Islam, actually the Iranian Revolution was rooted in Muslim Brother ideology, as much as in Shia doctrine. And Khamenei himself, the Rahbar, the leader, translated a number of books from Sayyid Qutb, the most radical ideologues of the brothers, into Farsi, right? And they even had a postage stamp with the image of Sayyid Qutb in 1944 in the Iranian Republic, so Islamic Republic of Iran. So it was mainly an issue of for or against political Islam. And the Iranians joined the... Now, this may be changing. I don't know. I mean, I'm being told that Erdogan, who, you know, in the good old days, Erdogan had zero, and when Ahmed Davutoglu was his foreign minister, he had the so-called zero enemies policies. Now, people say jokingly they had a zero friends policy. And he has to get back to Egypt and the like. So I'm being told that, you know, Erdogan is limiting the expression of Muslim brother refugees from Egypt in Turkey today. And even that Qatar is revising its Al Jazeera Arabic policy. Because after all, there may be some sort of an attraction which is superior in the business thing which is happening in the Abraham Agreement. So, you're right. When you think of the agreement, you also have to think who is not part of it. But then they may also join. So this is part of what is definitely challenging and changing.
So I have only one more because you have basically answered my Turkish question. Yes, and this is linked to then France and French policy, and you linked Afghanistan to Mali. That it can be the same type or similar type of failure.
Maybe as a teaser, but
okay. So let's explain more how it resonates, like in France, or what do you mean by that? I understand that there are certain similarities, but also many differences.
Yeah,
There was no attempt in Mali so far of the nation building like in Afghanistan. So it's much more a military type of operation, not very successful, and maybe France now is thinking about leaving, and there is this pretext of the Wagner forces for that. But the question is like, what is then the French discussion regarding Mali and Sahel? How to do, and how much the American pullout from Afghanistan is affecting, or in what it will lead regarding the French staying pullout recalibration of the Sahel-Mali policy?
Well, Macron has already recalibrated, and much of the forces are being relocated in Niger, if I'm not mistaken. So, which led to a declaration or a statement of one of the current ministers in Mali saying we're going to have the Wagner troops to replace us. And of course, the Turks are interested also to go there. As of the French population, it is not, it's not in the headlines. You don't have, a feeling like stop endless wars, as was the case in the swing states in the US. What I think is perceived as important is that it is a way to regulate illegal immigration, because Mali is the gateway, one of the main gateways to sub-Saharan Africa immigration into Libya, from which it is dispatched into Italy, and then through Italy to France, Northern Europe, and wherever. So I would say that, you know, the public opinion is much more, quote-unquote, tolerant, because they link it to threats on their territory, whereas in Ohio, you are not really, you don't feel threatened by Kabul to some extent.
All right, any questions from the audience? There is one. Be short, brief, precise. We have 10 more minutes.
I will try. Mr. Keppel, would you like to comment on the role of Pakistan in this whole thing? Because I think it's safe to say that they were ambiguous throughout the US intervention in Afghanistan, and that they might be viewed as the regional victor, if you will, of this whole thing. Thank you.
Well, I'm not the best expert to answer on that, but from my reading history and my experience way back, my gut feeling would be to agree with you, i.e. that the sort of blitz of the blitzkrieg of the Taliban could not have happened without significant Pakistani backing, and they came from Pakistan. They were all in Pakistan. They were educated in the Pakistan madrasas and among the Pakistan Taliban. So definitely when the Taliban were in ruling Pakistan under Mullah Omar, clearly they benefited from Pakistani blessing. There is no doubt about that. So what is good for Pakistan is generally perceived by the Indians as bad for them. So this is, of course, a big bone of contention. The last issue is Iran. Traditionally, Iran is perceived as very hostile to the Taliban and vice versa. The Taliban, the old Taliban, the father's generation, persecuted the Hazara, the Shia Afghan. They even killed a dozen or something Afghan diplomats in the consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif, which is in that region, who were celebrated as martyrs of the revolution. But it is also not unfair to say that whatever harms America is good for Iran today. Even though those guys are are Afghans and are Sunni fundamentalists. So this I don't know. I mean, but what I think is we can say at the minimal is that it would probably be mistaken to think that what happens in Afghanistan can remain within closed borders. See, that's what I hinted at at the beginning.
Well, I think there is no doubt that especially Pakistani intelligence service played a major role in the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Any comments, Cameron? No. Any other question? If there is no, well, okay. Matthias. I still have one more in my pocket if you are not going to ask.
Thank you. Well, this is a million-dollar question. I mean, I can speak for many who were there that the main emotion we felt was a total frustration that all our effort basically brought almost no fruit. And it's interesting when you read memoirs of, for example, Soviet commanders or Soviet diplomats, they pretty much felt the very same as we did. So the question is, did we just make tactical mistakes or we just never had any chance? And, you know, the West is just not capable to did nation building in such a culturally different country as is Afghanistan.
Yeah, and I have 30 seconds to answer. No, this, you know, remember I was unable to say US pullout. It's called came out as Soviet pullout when I started. And remember that when the Soviets came into Afghanistan, if you remember, Brzezinski, who was not only the national security advisor to Carter, but also who was feeling far more Polish than I'm feeling Czech, actually, decided that this was, hey, we're going to have the Reds. And so he wrote to Carter, we're going to inflict a Vietnam War to the Russians or to the Soviets. Well, it was true to some extent because it led to it was the nail, the golden nail in their coffin finally, and led to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. But when you look at what happened in Kabul, it evoked both the Soviet pullout and also the Vietnam pullout from 1975 with the helicopters and the Marines and the like. So Brzezinski, after his death, proved ultra-right, or should I say ultra-right, right? Definitely our model that your question, you could ask the same question with the Arab Springs. Like people thought so enthusiastically about the Arab Springs. And that, after the end of dictatorships in Southern Europe, after the fall of communism, now it was the turn of the Arabs to embrace democracy. Well, this has not exactly developed along those lines. And, and to an extent, Afghanistan created a civil society in urban centers where women went to school and the like, but then for some reason it was not, I don't know Afghanistan well enough to explain how, but it was not rooted. And the strange thing was that they did not even fire one shot. The huge brand new US Army, US trained and equipped army was unable to resist the Taliban blitz. Also because, as it's being said, this Taliban commander was the cousin or the tribal elder of the colonel of the armed forces. So they would make a tribal agreement, not a deal. And then the state and the civil society thing were clearly non-functional.
Well, some of those special forces who were the only ones really fighting, then some of them fled to Panjshir Valley and are still trying to resist somehow. So it was not that nobody was fighting, but definitely not the army as such.
You're right, but this does not invalidate my point because they belong to different ethnic groups.
Yep.
And mainly non-Pashtun.
Well, but in those special forces which joined in the Panjshir Valley, some of them are mixed because they have nowhere to go and they are basically against the wall. So they know that they will be either dead or they will survive there. But last question is yes and no. Answer. Yes, and it's about France, and you describe the European policies, etc.
So it has to be yes.
All right, that's going to be, that's a test. Here we are doing the defense studies, etc. France is talking about strategic autonomy in Europe and as a concept.
Yes.
Is France willing to put more money behind it in terms of more funding for French defense from the state budget into the French army or no?
I guess so. The answer will come with the election. And, well, if Macron is elected, he cannot be re-elected unless he becomes president for life or find a Medvedev to replace him, and because he can run then in 31 or something. And I guess that he doesn't have anything to lose politically. So he is interested in doing that, but this is not only a French decision. This is something that has to be done in coordination with the European partners. And definitely not everybody can put the same amount of money in the military budget. The big issue is Germany, of course.
Well, you have to lead by example, which France is already leading to some degree, especially compared to Germany. But
at times it was not that successful. No, if you ask me whether Macron thinks he is Napoleon, well, I don't know. You know, he starts as Bonaparte, clearly, but we'll see what the election leads to. Is it going to be Austerlitz or Waterloo? So we'll.
I don't think you have to be Napoleon. I just think that if you are seriously if the strategic autonomy should seriously work, then you must put not 2% of GDP behind it, but 5% or 4% of GDP. Otherwise, it's complete nonsense. Well, so this is my question. And by the way, unfortunately, as Czechs, we are even worse than French in putting money.
Yes, either 2% is not what most European countries do.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, one of the reasons why the subs issue with Australia was such a problem is that, you know, the subs were financing the nuclear, because France is the only nuclear country. And let me assure you, that costs a bundle.
Yeah.
So is it a yes thing?
Okay. It's not a no thing.
Okay, let's say it's a no.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming and staying with us till the end. Please join me in thanking to our wonderful speaker, Professor Keppel, and also to my co-moderator, Tomáš Pojar.